I heard about this story when I read in a local newspaper in northeastern Oregon that a county clerk had found records of a long-forgotten murder trial in an old safe. And the murder trial had to do with a group of whites who were accused of massacring, murdering a group of Chinese, and they were found innocent and let go. Now, I'm born and educated for the most part in Oregon, had at least a modest interest in history, knew nothing about this crime. This was one of the worst crimes ever committed against anybody in Oregon. I'm not, besides Native Americans, of course. And so I had said, we need to do this story for our paper. And so then I began investigating it. As part of the investigation, I needed to learn about the Chinese too. I had only the most brief knowledge of why the Chinese were here and what they were doing. So I did a lot of investigation of, who they were, where they came from, what they did, how they were treated. So it became kind of self-education in that process. Chinese miners arrived in Oregon in the Pacific Northwest around the year, in the late 1850s. They started in southern Oregon when gold was discovered in that area around Jacksonville and Ashland and Grants Pass. And they moved to northeastern Oregon around Baker City in that area for new gold strikes. And then on up to Lewiston, Idaho when gold was discovered along the Clearwater. I think that was in 1861. After a few years, there were more Chinese miners in the Northwest than there were Caucasian miners. During this period, it's important to know that while Chinese usually were discriminated against and not accepted, often employers preferred to hire the Chinese for several good reasons. From the employer's point of view, one, they worked harder than whites. Two, they worked for less, usually significantly less. And three, and importantly, they didn't want to unionize. They didn't go out on strike. And in this period in the 1860s and 1870s, this was a period of a great deal of labor agitation, particularly in California. White miners didn't like the idea of the Chinese taking any gold. In fact, when gold was first discovered, many of the Caucasian mining camps passed laws that barred the Chinese from mining gold at all. But the Chinese had already had the experience in California that the white miners soon tired of mining gold, and after they took the easiest gold, then they were anxious to sell their mines or leave them. So Chinese ostensibly weren't allowed to buy property or weren't allowed to mine in Oregon and other areas. They were able to buy mines from whites who wanted to sell out. And the Chinese very often got much more gold from the abandoned mines than the whites did originally. Well, in 1887, there were a group of miners had come down into the Oregon side of Hells Canyon from Lewiston, Idaho, and to mine gold along the river. And this was a very difficult journey for the miners because the Snake River is a north-flowing river at this point through Hells Canyon. And so it's a rough, wild river. And so the miners would have had to pull their boats and pole them along through the rapids and by the cliffs, to get to this mining site. I don't know if viewers are aware of it, but Hells Canyon is a deeper canyon than Grand Canyon. It lacks some of the grandeur of Grand Canyon, but it's significantly deeper with the high walls that don't allow easy access into it all. So the Chinese had been mining there at this site called Deep Creek for, probably about 4 or 5 months. There were a band of white horse thieves operating in northeastern Oregon in what is now Wallowa County. And they observed the Chinese mining in the canyon and decided to they plotted to take their gold, which they did. It was never understandable to me, and one of the reasons I wrote this particular book is, well, why did they have to kill them? Because they could easily have just taken the gold from the Chinese and let them go. And who would the Chinese have complained to? Who cared? No one. But the fact that they killed him, it was just clearly a savage act of racial hatred. Well, the killers threw the bodies of the Chinese into the river, Snake River, and the crime wasn't discovered for a couple of weeks till some of the bodies floated all the way to Lewiston, Idaho, where the crime was discovered. Other bodies may have floated clear out in the Pacific and were never found at all. There were nearly 3 dozen who were killed. The exact number isn't known. They were probably killed over a period of a couple of days because there were a lot of Chinese mining in the canyon, at various locations. And the area was so remote that no sheriff really wanted to go in there and to investigate the crime. There were 7 in the gang. And the young man who turned state's evidence was named Frank Vaughn, which is a very well-known name in Wallowa County even today. And in the testimony before the grand jury, he'd implicated all of the others for the crime. But by the time the matter came to a trial, then he changed his testimony and he blamed just those, well, I should go back just a little bit. Of the 6 killers, 3 of them were caught, 3 others escaped, including the ringleaders. And so Frank Vaughn, during the trial, pinned the crime on those who had escaped and said the 3 others who were caught were not innocent, had nothing at all to do with it. One was just a 15-year-old boy, as a matter of fact, so the jury let them go. I don't know of any attempt ever made to catch the 3 who escaped. His weak explanation was that they wanted to borrow a boat. The gang wanted to borrow a boat from the Chinese to take some of their stolen horses across the river into what is now Idaho to sell them. And this is what the killers were doing. They were stealing cattle and horses in Oregon and taking them on into Idaho and Montana where they were selling them. So he said they couldn't get the horses across the river without the boat, so they wanted to borrow the boat, and the Chinese wouldn't let them have the boat. And so the ringleader then, a guy named Blue Evans, got furious and ordered them to kill all the Chinese. Well, that was pretty weak. I think the reason for that is they didn't want to talk about gold during the trial because that was a real issue. Quite a bit of gold was involved and taken. But once they mentioned the word gold, then that would open up a whole new area of investigation, which was what happened to the gold. So there was a trial in 1888, and there was an indictment against six white members of this horse thieving gang, but a white jury found them innocent. Now, in my research, I discovered there are many crimes against the Chinese. This happens to be probably the worst of all of them committed by whites against Chinese who are in this country. But I never found a single case where a white jury found a white man guilty of killing or injuring a Chinese. They were let go. The Chinese, of course, they were appalled at the massacre and the loss of life. They also had had a lot of experience before this time with crimes against the Chinese, particularly in California. Now, the Chinese we're talking about in this period, probably as many as 150,000 at any one time, were primarily in California, and then they filtered up into Oregon and the rest of the Northwest in smaller numbers. The reaction was, well, I need to go back just a little bit. Because of the crimes that occurred in California, and these occurred in San Francisco and Los Angeles, Chinese were burned out of their homes in Northern California. There had been a lot of deaths in different places, and the Chinese complained. And as I mentioned earlier, no white man was put behind bars for one of these crimes against the Chinese. But what did happen in this period was trade with China was very valuable to the United States then as it is now. And so the Chinese began making monetary claims to the United States. And I think the figure was $2,000 for each individual loss of life. And then they claimed damages for loss of property as well. So Congress was approving fairly significant sums of money for the Chinese to compensate for the loss of life. So the letters that the Chinese legation did get involved in the investigation of the murder. And in the National Archives in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I did a lot of my research, you will find in these letters the Chinese being appalled at the crime and the deaths and the fact that nobody was investigating, and indeed nobody was investigating, and but saying you need to compensate us for this loss. And indeed the Chinese were compensated in most instances for other crimes, but in this one, for a peculiar reason, they never actually made a monetary claim for what happened in Hell's Canyon. The previous claims that had been paid to the Chinese, apparently the money did not always get back to the families of victims and the people who lost property. suggesting there might have been a fair amount of corruption, involved in this period. And so the head of the legation in Washington, D.C. was called back to China, and in a period of years he was beheaded. So my interpretation of that, this was not an incentive for the people who replaced him to really pursue these investigations. And in fact, all this happened about the time of the trial. The Chinese were informed by the U.S. government there was going to be a trial. To the best of my knowledge, they were never informed and never asked what the results of the trial were. And I think they were just concerned, the officials involved were just concerned what had happened to their predecessors. They just considered this a hot potato and didn't want to get into it. So the matter was dropped and covered up in Oregon for more than a century until, like I say, this county clerk found the old records in an old safe. There's a chapter in the book called The Secret Keepers. It's about two elderly women in the county who I was told early on knew about this crime as much as anybody did. One was this wonderful woman, Grace Bartlett, who was a county historian for many years, and the other was Marjorie Martin, who was a county clerk for many years, both of them now deceased. And at first they didn't want to talk to me at all, but I just kind of kept up my contacts, and eventually they did. And Marjorie Martin later acknowledged she was a county clerk who hid the records in an old safe. By the time she was talking to me, she was not always as clear as one would hope that she would be. But the explanation, as I got it, is she didn't want people to see the records, one. And then two, one of her friends in the county was a granddaughter of the leader of the killers, Blue Evans. When Blue Evans fled the county, the ringleader, when he left behind a wife and two children. And so a grandchild of one of those children was a good friend of Marjorie Martin's. And so she told me that now that her friend had died, is the way she put it, I can now talk to you, is the way she put it. There were these two things going on. One, Wallowa County is one of these places where there's not a lot of population turnover, and where people who live there today are descendants of the people who first went in there. And so that seemed to be a motive, a part of the people. Well, we don't want to offend these families by resurrecting the skeleton in the closet, so to speak. And then the other one was protecting the image of the county. Wallowa County's image will always be tarred by the fact that they kicked out the Nez Perce tribe in 1877, even though the Nez Perce had claim to the land and had treaty rights to the land. There was a fraudulent treaty that was developed that forced the Nez Perce out. So this has been, to me, a black mark on the county's history, and they've tried to come to terms with that over the years. Well, when I finally did a book launch up in Wallowa County, I was joking to my wife, my wife Candace, that I might be tarred and feathered. I don't know what I'll look like when I come home. But I did a talk there at what is called the Fish Trap House, and there's a writers group called Fish Trap up there, fairly well known. And so they had a packed house of probably 40 to 50 people there, and I did my presentation, and there was just one criticism. I had misspelled the Nez Perce name in the book, but other than that, I didn't get any criticism at all, which I was amazed about. So I chatted with my friend afterward, Rich Wanschneider, later, and said, I'm surprised that there was no hostility. And Rich said, I think we're just ready to hear about what happened up here. It's not that I've set out on a mission to explore the deep, dark, unknown corners of Oregon history, but as I've encountered these stories about slavery in Oregon and the massacre and mistreatment of the Chinese, I know these are not in Oregon's history books, but they're an important part of our history, and I think that they need to be known. For example, we don't know, it's not generally known that how much the Chinese contributed to the development of the Northwest. They built the railroads, they mined the gold, they cleared the land, they dug the ditches, and that was a huge help. They did work that white people didn't want to do. Similarities to what's going on with Hispanics. In the terms of African Americans, they led some of the wagon trains out here. They were fur trappers in the region, and then some came as slaves. We've already talked earlier about a former slave, Robin Holmes, who I think was an heroic figure in Oregon. He helped to clear the courts and clear the make clear that slavery was illegal here through a complaint that he brought to free his children. He and some other former slaves helped integrate a white church in Salem, and we know nothing about them. Nobody was keeping their history. They're just a word or two in a history book at all. And I think that's tragic. So if I've helped to bring some of that into our public awareness and keep some of that, put some of that history where it belongs, that's satisfying to me.